Welcome, everyone, to the fifth installment of the Ask a Yale Environmental Expert series hosted by Urban Resources Initiative and the experts from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Today we have Laura Green here to talk to us about the value of small plants. And in the past few weeks, we've heard from Dr. Ashton on forest and water, Dr. Easley about our relationships to the environment, Dr. Orfice about trees and agriculture, and Mike Ferrucci, Professor Mike Ferrucci, about where our toilet paper comes from. I am Caro. I work at Urban Resources Initiative, where I help run our Green Skills Tree Planting and Green Jobs program. I just wanted to share a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The way this works, if you haven't joined us before, is that we have about a 15-minute presentation from our expert, and we have a lot of time at the end for Q&A, for questions and answers. But you can also ask questions along the way by sharing them in the chat box. If you go to the bottom of your screen, there is a little chat icon, and you can type questions in there, and I'll be monitoring the chat box. And you can also raise your hand in the participant screen, or just unmute yourself and ask a question. We're recording this session, so you can go back and watch it again if you want to pay careful attention to what's been said, or to share it with your students or your friends. And now I want to introduce Laura Green, our expert for today. Laura is a Connecticut forester and a talented botanist. She's also a dear friend and a former classmate of mine from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She is my great pocket field guide. I take a lot of photographs of plants from the forest and send them to Laura for identification help, and she's one of my favorite people to go on walks in the woods with. So without further ado, here's Laura Green.
Thank you, Caro. So my name is Laura. I am, as Caro said, a forester and a field botanist. I live here in New Haven, and I work for the Yale School of Forests. You might have heard, if you were on the earlier sessions, you might have heard from Mark Ashton and Joe Orfice, who are faculty at the School of Forests, and I am one of the postgraduate fellows who does all kinds of odds and ends around the forest, and I particularly work on the research program at the School of Forests. And I really love plants of all sizes, but today I'm going to focus in on the little guys who live underneath the trees. So that is our project here today. And like Caro said, if you have questions at any point, just chime in, and I'll try to monitor the chat, and I think Caro also is going to help me notice if questions come in that way while we are talking. Caro, I'll ask for my first slide. Awesome. So just to get us kind of situated, the plants that we're talking about today are what we call understory plants. So they're plants that live underneath the canopy of a forest. When you think about the big tall trees, everybody who is not kind of in that strata, who's never going to get up there, and is kind of what we call a kind of a permanent resident of the understory. Those are the plants that we are thinking about right now. And most of the plants that I'm going to talk about today grow in forests because they're mostly plants that grow in Connecticut, and most of Connecticut is forest. But there are lots of small plants that grow in other kinds of habitats, and we might talk a little bit about some of those as well. Can I get the next slide?
Yeah.
Cool. So just sort of as we're getting started and now thinking about the kinds of plants that we're going to talk about, we all already have relationships with plants from our own experiences, and I think it's worth taking for 30 seconds and asking ourselves a question why we might care about small plants. And I've put some examples of plants down there, maybe jog your memory a little bit, thinking about walks you might have gone on or food you like to eat. And awesome, thank you, Benjamin, they are delicious. If you want to pop them in the chat, or you can just hold them in your heart. They're beautiful, they are, yeah. And conveniently closer to our height than a lot of the trees. Yeah. So I also came up with my own list of reasons why I care about small plants and why they're important. They help keep the soil from washing away. Yes, they do. Absolutely. So these are some of the reasons that I come up with for why I care about small plants and why lots of people care about small plants. First, that they are a source of food and medicine for people. The plant in the top left of the screen that you see there, blackberry, is a plant that grows all over Connecticut, delicious berries. And then tied into food and medicine, they also have cultural and spiritual value, big part of our identities. They're a major source of species diversity, of plant species diversity. In our forest here in Connecticut, we have many, many, many more species of understory plants than we do of canopy tree species. So for example, there's a picture in the middle there of a plant called tussock sedge or Carex stricta, which is a little wetland sedge species. Sedges are grass-like plants. They're not grasses, but they're kind of similar to grass. And sedges, we have 152 Carex species that are native to the state of Connecticut. So that's a lot of species. In contrast, we have about 180 species of trees total. So all the trees compared to the species in just this one genus of understory plant. They play an important role in nutrient cycling. Someone was pointing out they hold soil in place. They also help to collect nutrients that might otherwise get sort of washed away in the spring with snow melt. They provide food and shelter for animals of all kinds. They interact with our canopy trees, right? There's a period in the tree's life where it has to sort of start out down on the same level with these understory plants. And the plant on the bottom of those set of pictures, hay-scented fern, is an understory plant that foresters think about in relation to tree regeneration here in Connecticut. Hay-scented fern is able to spread really robustly in openings and can actually sort of prevent trees from regenerating in those spots. And they have all kinds of interesting and unique strategies that they use for dealing with the challenges of being an organism who's alive. So we have a lot to learn by studying them. Awesome. So I'm going to talk about 3 of these in a little bit more depth. Kara, if you want to hop to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit more about medicine and food for people, food and shelter for animals, and then some of those kind of cool, interesting life strategies that we can actually see happening right now in our forests, understory plants that live in them. Awesome. So firstly, getting started talking about food and medicine. Plants that we use for food and we use for medicine, often we have really deep relationships with, people have really deep relationships with, that tie into our sense of identity, our traditions, our history, how we think about who we are and our place in the world. An example from this continent, Anishinaabe peoples whose homelands are sort of just west of here, we're getting into what's now New York State and then up through the upper Midwest, have a really strong relationship with a plant called manumin, which you might know as wild rice. It's the plant that's on the right there in that image, really beautiful. And Anishinaabe peoples have traditions around how they take care of Manumin and how it then takes care of the people by providing this really essential food source. Kara, can I have the next slide? So we often think about plants providing food in that they provide starches and sugars for energy, which they make through photosynthesis. But they also make lots of other chemicals, some of which we really value. Plants use these chemicals for all kinds of purposes, including trying to prevent themselves from being eaten. Sort of paradoxically, we then want to eat them. But they also use the chemicals for growth regulation, for communication, that then have different impacts on us and our bodies and our physiology, and that we use sort of strategically and we seek out. Next slide has some examples of plants from North America and from Connecticut specifically that we use for medicine. One of them, willows, which people may think of like a big weeping willow, for example. A lot of our native species of willows are actually sort of smaller, shrub-like almost plants. They don't get really, really big, often grow in wet areas. And willows contain salicylic acid, which is a plant hormone. It plays a number of different roles in plants, including regulating growth, responding to herbivory, so responding to being eaten by something, and communicating about herbivory between plants through compounds that are actually released into the air and then are received by other plants in the area and sort of notify, oh, something's been eating me. And salicylic acid, the word salicylic actually comes from the Latin word salix, which is our scientific name for willows, and it's used to produce aspirin and also as an exfoliant in skincare products. Another skincare product related plant that we have here in Connecticut is witch hazel, which is another very common understory shrub plant, and which is used by indigenous peoples in Connecticut sort of topically, and I think also might have been taken internally for uses. And that European colonists then took and began producing commercially witch hazel, which is an astringent you may have seen in the drugstore, gets used in a lot of different kind of skincare products, reduces inflammation. And the last one, which I think is cool, we think about caffeine is really important to many of us. And often we think about coffee or tea being the main sources of that. There's also a plant that is native to the southeastern United States called yaupon holly, which is related to the hollies that we have here in Connecticut, but is not a species that grows here, and also has caffeine in its leaves, and also can be drunk as a caffeine sort of stimulant beverage. And caffeine is a really interesting chemical that actually has evolved a number of different times throughout sort of geologic time in plants, and it serves a couple of different purposes. It is toxic to insects in high quantities, so it's another of these chemicals that helps prevent plants having their tissues eaten by insects. But it also helps attract pollinators. Some plants will actually have a small level of caffeine in their nectar, which improves the visitation by bees, and so then the pollination of that plant. So sort of serving multiple purposes within the plant, and also a very valuable purpose for us. Okay, we'll move on to the next role of plants, of understory plants. So we talked a little bit about herbivory and insects eating plants when we're talking about reasons why plants produce these specific compounds that we then want. They're really close linked relationships between a lot of plants and insect species, and then sort of moving up the chain, links between plants, insects, and then the birds and mammals and the other animals that eat those insects, as well as eating the plants. A lot of our insect species, I talked a little bit about the sheer sort of number of different plant species we have, which is totally dwarfed by many orders of magnitude by the number of insect species we have. And a lot of our insects are specialists and have really particular requirements for the plants that they will eat and live on. They may be limited to one or a handful of species or genera of plants that they use for food. And this is just an example of one of those sort of linked cycles with goldenrod species that we have that grows here in Connecticut, tall goldenrod, which is the food and habitat for a particular species of fly called the goldenrod stem goller. And the goldenrod stem goller lays its eggs in the stems of goldenrod, and those that then induces the plant to form a gall, which is a sort of modified tissue within the plant that provides a little house and food for that growing insect larva. And some of our bird species, in particular downy woodpeckers, which is our smallest woodpecker species. That's the picture of the bird at the bottom of that triangle. Downy woodpeckers will go out and then look specifically for galls on these goldenrod plants to find the larvae of this fly that are growing inside, and then we'll eat the larvae of the fly. So really sort of tight and kind of looping connections between all of these different organisms. And that then has implications for the abilities of our birds to complete their own life cycles. Breeding birds require protein-rich food in the form of insects for their babies. Even bird species that happily eat plants, fruits, berries, nuts for the rest of the year really need that protein for baby birds. And when we have more variety in the plant species that we have, that provides more habitat for different insect species, and which is also important because birds need food for babies, insects for their babies during a very specific period of time, and that doesn't match with the time when every insect species is sort of available and out and active. So having a sort of full range of habitat for different insects means that there's better availability for more different types of food for birds year-round, which then allows them to be successful in reproducing. And this is an image here of our eastern towhee, which is a bird of our forest in Connecticut that builds its nests very close to the ground in the sort of understory plants, and also forages year-round on insects that live close to the ground that eat sort of decaying plant matter and things. So just another example of those connections between birds, plants, insects. And this question about providing food for birds also kind of ties us into questions that often come up about what kinds of species are better or less good in terms of providing habitat for animals, and then often leads us into questions about native species and non-native species. So Carol, if you can go to the next slide. To do a little sort of definition of terms, the term native species is used to describe species that evolved in the place that they're found now, sort of spread through interactions with animals, through the wind, gravity, kind of moved of their own power or through interactions with other organisms to be in the place where they're found now. It's dependent on geography. So there are species that are native species here, like that goldenrod, tall goldenrod that we were just talking about with the little fly that forms galls, which is a native species here in Connecticut. elsewhere in the world where it's been transported by humans, it is not native and is an invasive species and causes problems. So non-native species are species that evolved elsewhere and then were introduced to the place they're now found because of the actions of people. It could have been intentional or unintentional, but they basically crossed some kind of major barrier that they would not have been able to cross without the input of people to arrive where they're found now. That doesn't necessarily mean just because a species is brought from one place to another, doesn't necessarily mean that it will be able to sort of get established there and sustain itself and spread. So tulips, for example, which we may have seen in yards all over the place right about now. Beautiful spring flower that we like to plant in our yards. Tulips are not a native species here in Connecticut, but they do not sort of successfully reproduce themselves into growing and spreading populations in the wild. They're sort of confined to where we put them, more or less. In contrast, the plant that's right next to it, black swallowwort, is a plant that we would describe as invasive here in Connecticut, and it spreads very readily and poses problems for sort of functioning within our ecosystems. In particular, black swallowwort is in the same family. It's related to our milkweeds, like common milkweed, which is the image right above it, which people might be familiar with because of the role it plays in the lives of monarch butterflies. And black swallowwort is a common, close enough species that butterflies will confuse it for a milkweed and will lay their eggs on it, but the caterpillars are not able to survive eating black swallowwort. And so it then sort of prevents those butterflies from being successful in reproducing. Okay, next slide. Oh, I think I might be frozen.
Or Carol might be frozen.
Oh, okay. Carol might be frozen. Cool.
I have some shaky internet, but it should be up now.
Yes, awesome, awesome. Thank you. No, I was thinking that my internet here also periodically flashes the like unstable connection. Just gets your adrenaline going. Awesome. So there are I wanted to just sort of feature an example of one of the ways here in New Haven that people are trying to sort of participate in an active and helpful way in these relationships between specific plants, specific insects, and bird habitat, which is the Urban Oasis project, which was a partnership between a bunch of different organizations, including URI, to do some restoration work in a bunch of different parks across New Haven to create these areas that have a higher quality of habitat for bird species in particular. So the image here is, I think, from Edgewood Park. The sort of preparation for planting an urban oasis there, which involves sort of removing non-native plant species and replacing them with native plant species that are able to support our native insect species that rely on them, which are not able to eat necessarily those specialist insect species, not able to then to eat non-native plant species that evolved someplace elsewhere. Yeah, they're really cool. I would definitely recommend, if you look at this little map here and say, oh, that looks like walking distance from where I live. They're really awesome little sort of pockets of habitat across the city, and are definitely getting started. This is a great time of year. You could sort of go now and then keep going throughout the growing season and see how they change throughout time.
We also have a comment that says, I'm so happy to see 6 schoolyards in this initiative. So I know that teachers can apply for funding to have a urban oasis schoolyard habitat installed at their school. So it's a great initiative here in New Haven.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome. Great. Okay, so we'll move on to our last kind of deep dive into what makes little plants kind of particularly interesting, which is the way that they deal with the challenges of being an organism. And one of the questions, I think, if we imagine ourselves as a little plant underneath a canopy of trees, that we might wonder is, how are we going to get enough light? Right? We need sunlight to photosynthesize, to produce sugars, for energy, so that we can sustain ourselves. If you're underneath the full canopy, we know from the experience as a person walking in a forest in the summer, right, it's a lot darker, it's a lot cooler, it's very pleasant and lovely, as people who might be trying to avoid that really direct sunlight. But light, the light that plants are able to use for photosynthesis doesn't include all of the light in the sort of light spectrum. There's a particular range, 400 to 700 micrometers of wavelength, that is effective for photosynthesis. We call that photosynthetically active radiation. And I included a graph here that I think is helpful in just kind of visualizing that, showing the different plant pigments that are able to absorb light of various wavelengths. And so light, as it's hitting canopy leaves up at the top, those leaves are absorbing a lot of that light, and then they're transmitting some of it through their leaves. The light that is being absorbed, right, then isn't getting to filter down to the lower levels of the canopy. There's an impact. Having canopy leaves has an impact then on the quality of light that gets down to the lower levels of the forest and down to those understory plants. And then, can I get the next slide? Awesome. And here in Connecticut, where a lot of our trees are deciduous, so they're losing their leaves in the winter, the amount of light that is getting down to the lower levels of the lower strata in the forest varies significantly across the year. The graph down at the bottom here that has all those squiggly lines is from the Southern Appalachians, but same general pattern as we see here in Connecticut. So the line is showing sort of the amount of light essentially that is getting down to the forest floor, and you can see it's much higher during the winter, and then as we get into the spring, it really drops off. This is showing across 3 different landscape positions, so sort of up on a ridge, kind of in the middle, and then like down where it's more wet. But it's basically the same pattern no matter where you are. If you're in a deciduous forest during the winter, you're getting lots of light that's coming down because there aren't leaves. And then during the summer, once leaves come on, you're getting a lot less light that's getting all the way down. And understory plants are able to have sort of evolved particular strategies for dealing with this, including just playing off of the timing of when this happens, which is called phenology. Phenology just generally describes the time during a year when an organism does something. The graph at the top, if we could go back 1 slide. So that the map at the top there is showing the phenology of when leaves come out across the country, and the sort of more orange colors are earlier, the greener, bluer colors are later during the season. So this is sort of one measure of the arrival of spring, and the way that it changes across the country. So at any given point, the timing when spring arrives, when trees start to put out their leaves, that's a really important turning point for understory plants as well, because it then has this really significant impact on the amount of light that they're getting. Okay, awesome. Now the next slide. So this is a couple of examples of ways that understory plants use phenology and use the timing of canopy tree leaf out to their advantage in terms of getting enough light. One of those options is just leafing out really early. So if you've been on a walk out in the woods in the last month or so, and you've noticed that there are plants down low on the forest floor in the understory that are totally green, might be flowering already, while the canopy trees are totally bare, no leaves at all. This is a strategy we call these plants spring ephemerals. An example is the plant on the right side of the screen with those weird shaped white flowers. That's Dutchman's breeches. And it basically completes sort of all of its above ground work during the very, very early spring when canopy trees haven't leafed out yet. So it puts out those leaves, collects lots of sugars, flowers, sets seed, and then it's done. This also means that it's able to take up, it's also playing a role in nutrient cycling. So when we have snow that melts over the winter, and then that runoff in the early spring has a potential to carry a lot of our nutrients, nitrogen, for example, out of our forests and into our waterways. And plants that are growing during that time period are able to take up those nutrients and store them in their tissues. And then when they finish their work of the year, sort of later on in the spring, and those above ground tissues die back, they're releasing those nutrients back down into the soil. And at that point, canopy trees that have leafed out and just other plants that are active later on in the year are then have an opportunity to use them. So the sort of the nutrients are staying in the system. Another strategy is changing your leaf structure during the course of the year, having different kinds of leaves at different points during the year. We call this plasticity, like plastic, so kind of malleable, which means there are plants like alum root, which is the middle image there of those green leaves. Alum root puts out leaves that are quite different between the spring and the fall in order to maximize its ability to collect carbon through photosynthesis, depending on the varying light conditions it finds itself in the spring and the fall. And another example of that, hepatica, which is the sort of leftmost images, that purple flower and those red leaves. Hepatica is able to be sort of almost evergreen and keep leaves through the winter that are able to continue photosynthesizing if sort of weather conditions are right, if it's warm enough, throughout the winter and in the very early spring. And you can see those leaves have a kind of a dark red color, and these are pigments that almost act as kind of like a sunscreen for leaves. So they're protecting the photosynthetic machinery of the leaf from getting damaged by light in the same way that our skin can get sunburned. Light, kind of a double-edged sword, right? It's necessary in order to power photosynthesis, but too much of it also will damage the tissues. And so plants have all kinds of strategies to deal with that. One of them being these pigments that help protect its ability to continue photosynthesizing. And these are the same pigments that you're seeing also in fall leaves later on in the season, and that's sort of a different mechanism. In that instance, the plants are sort of dismantling chlorophyll because really resource sort of intensive to maintain those structures, and the plants want to sort of take them apart and then recoup those resources before they drop the leaf at the end of the season. Anyway, but serves a slightly different, we also see those colors in some understory plants that stay green and are photosynthesizing during really sunny conditions in the winter. Awesome. Next slide. So, in closing, before we sort of turn to a more kind of open discussion and conversation, I wanted to share with you some of my favorite resources and ways that I like to learn about plants. There are tons of resources online that are available to you. If you want to start, my biggest recommendation to anybody who wants to know more about plants, about understory plants, is just to get out and start walking around, start looking at the plants in your neighborhood. Here in New Haven, we have lots of parks, lots of street trees, thanks to URI, schoolyard gardens, all kinds of places where you can go and kind of get up close and personal and start to develop a relationship with the plants around you. I really love taking a little a magnifying glass or a hand lens. This is mine. I just keep it with me when I'm out walking, because there are lots of little structures and features on plants that are very small, and if you have something that helps you see them, that's another way to sort of really dive into the details. It can be kind of almost meditative practice to go out and just look at things. And yeah, there are lots of guidebooks about identifying plants. The first link that I listed there, Go Botany, is a tool from an organization called the Native Plant Trust. But it's a list of has information about every plant that grows wild in Connecticut. It's really got everything. There are also books that have sort of a slightly more edited, more condensed list of plants that might be things you're a little bit more likely to come across, and books of like flowers specifically as well that are super helpful. Awesome. I would love to then have a conversation with you guys about your thoughts about understory plants. If you have questions, things that I was unclear or confusing about, I'm sure there were. We can turn to that now.
Thank you so much, Laura. Oh my gosh, your knowledge and passion for small plants is totally contagious. That was great. And thanks for sharing those resources with us for those of us who want to learn more. We have a question in the chat box already, which I'll read in a moment, but as you come up with questions, just throw them in or raise your hand in the participant box. So from Chris, we have the question, I have found many students are concerned about being harmed by bugs and plants. What should they worry about and what should not be a concern?
Oh yeah, great question. Well, I much prefer talking about plants outside where we can like actually touch them, but there's some plants that you don't want to touch. So the first one that I always talk about is poison ivy. That's one that people are often know about and are concerned about. Poison ivy is a woody vine, so it grows both sometimes up trees. You might see kind of a hairy looking, like a reddish hairy looking vine growing up a tree, kind of stuck to the bark almost of the tree. That's poison ivy. But it also grows kind of lower on the ground, which can make it sort of harder to notice sometimes. And it really it needs a fair amount of light, so it's often growing kind of on the edges of trails and things. The way that often people will have heard, there's a rhyme, leaves of 3, let it be. So poison ivy has leaflets in groupings of 3. They are sort of like a set of 3 kind of almost like diamond shaped or kind of oblong leaves coming out of the stem grouped together. The leaflets, a leaflet is a subdivision of a leaf anyway. You might just read it as like, oh, that plant has leaves that are grouped in 3s, but they are kind of cross-shaped almost. So the bottom 2 are generally at a kind of a wide angle like this, and then the middle one. Now they're just starting to leaf out, and a lot of the time they'll be kind of a shiny and have a lot of those red pigments in them at this point in the season. That's the main plant to look out for. And then in terms of insects, ticks, obviously, if you're going to be out in the woods in Connecticut, you have to be careful for that. I just, anytime it's above freezing, if I go out in the woods, if I go out for a walk, not even necessarily in the woods, when I get home afterwards, I check my whole body for ticks, and that's the best way try and if you catch them quickly after they've been on you, then you really minimize your risk there. But that's sort of just vigilance, unfortunately, is kind of our best strategy there. And then if you do find that you have a bite and it's been on you for a number of hours, you can save that tick and send it in to get tested. The Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station actually does testing. And you can also go into a doctor or maybe now call your doctor, and tell them that you were bit by a tick. Not all ticks transmit Lyme disease specifically, which is what people are most worried about. But you can tell them that you were bit by a tick, and they can help you get access to antibiotics. Yeah, that's a good question. But the vast majority of plants and insects, just looking at them or just touching them won't hurt you. I definitely very strongly emphasize that you should not eat anything. Don't eat anything unless you are really, really sure that you know what it is that you're eating. You know what else looks like it. And also that you know something about the way that it functions in the ecosystem. What is it providing food for? How long does it take for it to grow part of the plant that you want to be eating? Some of the plants that get used for food and for medicine take a really, really long time to grow and to reproduce. And so when we take the whole plant, we take a significant portion of the plant, we're really impacting the populations of those plants and their ability to sustain themselves and keep going.
Laura, that really leads itself nicely into our next question, which is, are there any resources, books, or websites for people who want to learn to forage here in Connecticut?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure that there are. That's not an area that I am specifically quite as knowledgeable about. I have some books on like edible plants. This one, for example, is a Peterson field guide to edible wild plants. This is for not just the Northeast. I know there are also lots of blogs that people who are present online. It's unfortunately just a part of the world of botany that I'm less keyed into. But I think there are lots of resources out there if you are willing to poke around a little bit. Yeah, and again, just recommending that if you're excited about that, that's awesome. I think that is a really powerful way that people sort of build a sense of connection to the larger sort of world that we're a part of in terms of other organisms that we're sharing the planet with. I think that's really great. And there are definitely plants that are kind of an easier place to start, more of a sure bet if you want to be trying to eat them. Some of our like berry producing shrubs like raspberries, blackberries, blueberries that you can learn to identify pretty easily and that are sort of also familiar because we've also domesticated them and eat them, but they also grow wild on our landscape.
Great. It looks like from Terrence, we also have a resource showing poisonous plants. I haven't downloaded it myself. It's in the chat box. I'm a little worried about my shaky internet, but folks can check that out if they want. And does anyone else have a question for Laura? I know I have a few. Any recommendations for the understory of our home gardens?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're interested in sort of gardening with an eye towards providing services for other organisms, for insects, for birds, people may be familiar with Doug Tallamy's work, who he has done a bunch of research on the value of various different native plants for insect species, especially butterflies, I think, and moths. So there are definitely resources that people who are more involved in sort of horticulture and gardening have put together about plants that are good for that. I know if you want to look into that the first link that that I have listed on that page, Go Botany, the Native Plant Trust. Native Plant Trust also has a botanical garden and sells plants. So they have a lot of resources related to sort of gardening with native plants, as well as like a whole bunch of like online courses I think that you can do that are specifically related to that.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. We have just a few more minutes, so if anyone else has a question to add, this is your moment. I have a question in the meantime. Laura, do you have a favorite place to go in New Haven to check out small plants in the forest?
Yeah, so I really love West Rock Park. West Rock is my favorite place. I go regularly. West Rock and East Rock are both examples of talus slopes, trap rock ridges, which is a very particular kind of geologic feature that we have here in Connecticut that's sort of unique. And so associated with that has a bunch of kind of unique habitats and plant species that grow on it. And now is an awesome time to go and see lots of spring ephemerals like the Dutchman's breeches that I talked about right at the very end. Those are flowering, those are up right now. I saw a whole bunch of them in East Rock Park last weekend, for example. Yeah, that's my favorite spot. Go and see some of my favorite flowers.
Great. One last question before I announce next week's speakers. From Jude, do you have any favorite understory plants that you look forward to finding?
Yes, thank you, Jude, for this question. I really love bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. It's one of the first plants that when I was starting to learn plants, which I did not do at all really until after I graduated from college. I was working in a park in New York City, and there was a little patch of bloodroot that somebody had planted, a previous employee had planted, and I would go and visit it like every week, starting way too early because I didn't really know when it was supposed to come up, but I would go back to that spot and look for it and look for it and look for it, and when it finally came up, I just felt so excited. And so I really love bloodroot. It's got a the image on the opening slide, and I think on the last slide I included a picture of bloodroot because that's my favorite. It also has really cool interactions with ants. It has seeds that are dispersed by ants. They have a little has a little kind of like fatty bit attached to the seed called an elaiosome, which ants go and collect, and then they pick that part off, they feed it, they eat it, and then they discard the seed. They're basically, the ants are sort of gardening for the bloodroot by kind of planting those seeds. Yeah, that's my favorite.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. This talk will also, it was recorded. It will be on URI's YouTube page. So thank you for all of your expertise. And next week, you can tune in to hear Dr. Benoit talk about bioswales, how they function, why we have them on our landscape, which is great. We're actually just installing the next round of bioswales in New Haven now. And then the week after that, we'll have Dr. Villegas from Panama tuning in to talk to us about forests and biodiversity, and specifically about his work with bats. So thank you, everyone. I think we'll stay on the call just for a little bit to make sure we have attendance. But at this point, you can tune out, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, thank you everybody for spending some time with me this morning. And if you want to send me an email, my email's on that that last slide. Yeah.
Thank you.
I do. Thank you. And I do recommend following up with Laura if you have a question about a small plant in your world. She's very good at remote plant ID.